In this video, I will introduce the generative outline tools found at ghostwriterqa.org, mirrored at findmysite.org/ghostwriter. So you will be learning how to write your own generative outlines and how to use them to produce a first draft document. However, before we get to the how-to portion, we're going to take some time to explore the what and why behind generative outlines. If you would like to jump to the how-to portion of this video, skip to the time displayed on your screen. That being said, here's what we're going to touch on in this video. First, we will provide a brief primer on large language models, LLMs for short, including an examination of how they relate to authorship and accuracy. Then we'll start the how-to section by introducing the Ghostwriter Q&A specifications, that is, how to write a generative outline. This will be followed by a video of us using the specifications to produce a draft document. So let's begin. You've probably heard a lot about large language models. You may have even played with them yourself. But what are they? You may have heard them referred to as automated BS artists or mansplaining as a service. But I've come to prefer the moniker spicy autocomplete. This is because at their core, that's what they are, text completion engines. Most of us are familiar with language models like those on our phones that attempt to predict the next word in a sentence. LLMs are their much, much larger cousins. As with traditional language models, they start with some collection of words and make a guess about what comes next. What counts as a right answer is a product of probabilities, namely the probabilities defined by some set of training data. That is, how frequently words in that training data find themselves in the same neighborhood. There's often no single right answer, but depending on the training data, some options are more likely than others. For example, I'm not much of an ice hockey fan, apparently. You're probably used to seeing these smaller language models at work in many of our digital tools. Here, for example, is a screenshot from my email client. Happy to suggest how I might sign off. So what's different about LLMs? Well, two words: big data. And I mean trained on the better part of the World Wide Web big. But that's not the only way in which these models are large. Unlike their petite cousins in your phone's keyboard that tend to base their predictions on the last word or two, these models are happy to base things on much bigger strings of text and much more nuanced context. We call that bit of text that you feed these models to get them going a prompt. And since they're trained on the web, if you give them the right prompt, they can do a lot more than just predict one word at a time. Here's a very unsurprising example. If I start the Gettysburg Address, I can actually get it to finish things off. That being said, it turns out that spicy autocomplete can do a lot more than finish quotes because it picks up on more context than just the presence of words. For example, it can make a go at identifying parts of speech. And if you write something in the form of a dialogue, it will do its thing and predict the next set of words. And this is how the majority of folks have been introduced to LLMs as chatbots. Here's the obligatory ChatGPT slide. Now, since LLMs are trained on very large collections of text, they've seen it all, so to speak. And it turns out that a good sentence completion machine can produce some pretty interesting results. Let's see if we can get a very, very short story. Okay. Well, it's no for sale, baby shoes never worn, but LLMs are reasonably good at taking direction. This shouldn't be surprising. The model is literally trained to produce plausible sounding strings of words based on those that came before it. And it has seen a lot of words. Of course, there are a lot of ways to string words together, say like a multiple choice question. And for the record, E is the right answer. Now, to be clear, all of the text input and output since the big data slide above is real. The prompt was the prompt and the output was the output. So this brings us here to a graph showing the performance of various LLMs on the multi-step bar exam along that of the average student. Here's the average passing rate, the performance of the average student, and here's GPT-4, a very large language model. This is saying something. Maybe it's saying more about the test than about the taker, but it's saying something, and it calls to mind a meme. As the good Dr. Malcolm observed, you were so preoccupied with whether or not you could, you didn't stop to think if you should. Tools based on LLMs provoke a lot of questions, and I'd like to take a moment to explore two of them before building on that exploration to create a simple heuristic users of such tools can use to guide their use. So first, what counts as authorship? And second, how can we ensure accuracy in our writing? I propose that both of these questions are really getting to the matter of trust. That is, how does a reader come to trust a text? Before we move on, let us stop to consider that large language models are just that, models. And as George Box noted, all models are wrong, but some are useful. We must not confuse the map for the territory. A map can never tell you everything about the world around it, but it can get you from A to B. This observation suggests some guidelines. If a model's output is wrong, it should start, not in discussion. And we can only evaluate a model's usefulness in comparison to an alternative. So we always have to ask, compared to what? Now, some people have suggested the answer to this question, what counts as authorship, is simple. It's no AI-assisted writing, full stop. But consider that we've been using simple language models for some time now without the same level of panic. What makes some machine-based word predictions more palatable than others? Let's play around a little. Here's a writing project we're working on. What's that red squiggly line? Oh, it's just a typo. The computer is pointing out an obvious mistake. Surely, spell check is a permissible use of machine-based word prediction. Hey, I wonder what those double blue lines mean. Oh, well, grammar check. It's just spell check for short phrases. The computer is just trying to help make my writing more clear. When I use MS Word, I don't have to credit it as a co-authorship, right? Oh, look, here's a neat tool from like 2013. It's like an interactive style guide pointing out places where I could make different choices. And it tells me about things that are too complicated. Oh, well, as a rule, I don't cite the style guide I'm using when I write something. This is helpful. I'll just change this and maybe that. Of course, if I replace all the sentences based on a style guide suggestions, I could get into some Ship of Theseus territory. I'm still the author, though, right? Well, I know what I want to write. I just don't know how to phrase it. I wonder if ChatGPT could help. Well, so what's going on here? In all of these examples, we start with some human input. Then a machine makes a suggestion, and we combine the two to produce a final product. Maybe you started to feel queasy before the GPT example, but either way, what makes one use case different than another? Are they different? If we answer yes, then we may not have a principled objection such that we can say no to all AI-assisted writing. Is it that the machine intervention somehow feels like a roll of the dice? Admittedly, it's a weighted dice, suggesting probable word choices, but it still feels like a roll of dice. Is that the issue? I don't think so, because there's a long tradition of using randomness in writing. There are an endless supply of novels loosely based on someone's Dungeons and Dragons campaign, and though some might look down on the authors of such texts, they're still authors, right? What about all those novels from lawyers loosely based on some old case of theirs? How much of authorship is the discovery of an idea? Do authors conforming to genre conventions forfeit their authorship because they lack originality? There's actually a long tradition of using constrained randomness in writing. Philip K. Dick won a Hugo Award for The Man in the High Castle, a book he wrote in part by consulting the I Ching, a text that, according to tradition, makes use of random numbers to divine the future. But he, not the I Ching, won the Hugo. An argument could be made that this was a collaboration between Dick and the authors of the I Ching, but when pushed to its limit, such an expansive definition of authorship might have to admit the authors of all books an author has ever read. In a sense, all of literature is a collaboration reaching back to the creation of language. But I digress. Revisiting our user plus machine inputs framing, it seems that adding another pass of edits to our text can make it look a lot like The Man in the High Castle. That is, the use of random machine produced text need not remove the right to claim authorship as far as creativity is concerned. Sometimes the creative process works to the subtraction of irrelevance. So it's not a problem that we're getting some random junk that we have to whittle down. It's like the old tale about Michelangelo claiming that he simply removed the irrelevant parts to reveal the sculpture within the stone. The truth is that authorship depends on context. What does an audience expect of its author? What are their professional norms? Authorship lies on a spectrum. Context matters. Different professions, different contexts have different expectations. Does anyone expect a press release to have a named human author? Sometimes signing one's name to a document doesn't mean I wrote this. It could mean I endorse this or I take responsibility for this. There are many legal briefs written by paralegals, but authored by senior partners. I can't even begin to count the number of template-based legal documents that start with cut and paste. Academic papers are often shaped quite strongly by the feedback of anonymous reviewers. And of course, there's always the profession of ghostwriter. This spectrum does, however, imply a directionality. For good or ill, we do look differently at the genre writer who writes formulaic page turners than we do the auteur who bucks convention. So in an attempt to draw a line, it seems worth interrogating the relationship between the information a would-be author puts into the writing process and what is coming out. Here I've represented the information content of the writer's input and the final outputs as functions, that is, the information content of input and the information content of output. If we speak only of this written input and output, a heuristic, I think, presents itself. If an input contains more or an equal amount of information to that on the output, the question of authorship seems quite distant. Spell check doesn't suggest any new meaning. It endeavors to correct a Scrivener's error. It's not adding information. Similarly, corrections to grammar mostly maintain the information content. In such cases, the final output, even when modified by a machine, doesn't contain any more information than we put in. If, however, the information content of the output exceeds that of the input, it feels like we're entering the danger zone. Of course, this is a little bit of a dodge because we can't actually create information out of thin air. There's something we're leaving out in this representation. That information came from somewhere, but that's the point, right? If the final product contains something that the author didn't put there, it had to come from somewhere. And though I don't think this is a bright line, one perhaps conservatively could say that everything on one side involves authorship, while everything on the other side requires a closer examination. That being said, let us pause and take a step back to look at the question of accuracy. There was a time not too long ago when media discussion of AI hallucinations referred to something like this, a painting here from Google's Deep Dream. Today, however, this moniker is a stand-in for LLM output not based in reality. So let's look at an example. Here I've asked ChatGPT who I am, that is, who is David Colarusso, and thanks to the fact that I have a unique enough name and get mentioned from time to time on the interwebs, it's able to paint a description of someone who looks a lot like me. As of my knowledge, cut off in September 2021, David Colarusso is an attorney and a technologist known for his work in the intersection of law and technology. True. He has a background in both computer science and law, which has allowed him to bridge the gap between the two fields. David has been involved in various projects related to legal technology and access to justice. That's fair. At the time, David Colarusso was the director of the Legal Innovation and Technology Lab at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Wait, I do direct that lab, but the lab's not at MIT. What's going on here? Well, since we know how LLMs work, it's pretty easy to explain. I'm not actually that well known. Only a very small part of the internet has anything to say about me. People with backgrounds that read like mine, however, who are talked about a lot on the internet, often find themselves at MIT. Now, I don't tell the media folks at Suffolk, but we've got a lot of work to do in raising our brand recognition. All joking aside, this hallucination isn't really a hallucination at all. It's a spicy autocomplete doing its thing. Here's another example. I asked ChatGPT to provide me with a list of the 3 most important law journal articles on the use of AI in document automation, along with some citations. Oh, this looks pretty good. Those are real authors. I don't know these articles, huh? Oh, do a little research. Turns out that article was never actually written. It doesn't exist. Huh. Same for these authors here, and this one too. These papers don't exist. They're fictions. They're just spicy autocomplete doing its thing. That is guessing the next word in a string, and putting them together in a way that looks plausible, but isn't based in any reality. There are a lot of problems here. The problem isn't so much that spicy autocomplete is always wrong. When you ask it to, it can actually get pretty good answers sometimes. The problem is that it provides no clues as to when it's wrong. This is where the BS and mansplaining as a service labels come from. When faced with a tool that is often right and sometimes wrong, without any way to distinguish between the two, it just becomes a little too easy to accept the output as right. We tend to just become lazy and figure, that's right most of the time. And that can be really dangerous, because in the end, spicy autocomplete is holding up a mirror. Really, it's a snapshot of a moment when its training data is stopped. Its guesses are to a first approximation based on the frequency of words found on the internet. Now, assuming someone working in tech has to come from MIT is one thing. But what happens when it makes a guess about someone when all it knows is that they come from a minority group? Do we really like what we see when we look in the mirror? So we noted earlier that the information in our output had to come from somewhere. When working with LLMs, it comes from two places. Either the user who constructed it, from the user constructed prompt, and from the data that was used to train the LLM. So why did ChatGPT think I worked at MIT? Well, it's because the ratio of information is because there wasn't much information in my prompt, right? I just said, who is David Colarusso? Almost no information there. So all the information was coming from the training data. And in that training data, the ratio of information contained that was relevant there was a good deal less than that contained that was distracting, which is sort of to say that having relevant and correct input is good, and even more is better. So if we want the output to get the right answer, there needs to be some critical mass of good input, where that input is a combination of user input and training data. If the user doesn't know something, and there aren't good examples in the training data, how do we reach this critical mass? Well, we could use the author's prompt to run a more traditional search, fetching relevant information and adding it to back to our prompt. This might result in a prompt that looks something like this, which is a combination of the user's input, search results, and some pre-written connective text. Okay. This produces output that looks really great. And since you know where you scored or where you sourced your data from, you can provide citations. In search, at least, this seems to be the way a lot of folks are going. See, for example, Bing Chat. But all models are wrong. What if the search returned bad results? Would anyone know? After all, spicy autocomplete is really good at writing plausible sounding text. It seems dangerous hiding our work behind a curtain, even if that curtain is a citation. I mean, let's be honest, who reads the footnotes? Conversely, what if spicy autocomplete is not being used for search, but rather writing? And it's too good at replicating the search results and just parrots back the exact words. How will we know to quote the original source? Well, instead of triggering a search, we could ask the user to provide more information, growing the information found in our input until we reach our critical mass, building on user content, responding to structured questions. This is just the method above minus the search, and it has the benefit of always having a person in the loop. But if the user doesn't know the answer to the question, what do we do? Well, we could perform a search and let the user review the results before adding them to our prompt. This still seems like an awful lot of work, though, but it would help ensure accuracy, at least as far as the user's expertise and experience allows. The point really is this. It would seem that if we want accurate answers, for the moment at least, we need to be sure that the information content of the user-touched input exceeds or equals that found in the output. This should look familiar, actually. It's the heuristic we use to gauge authorship. Of course, there we were talking about user-generated content, which means, in the end, we're actually left with one simple guideline. The information content of what the would-be author inputs should exceed or equal that of the output. But wait, you're saying, if I have to write something with all the information found in the output, where are the efficiencies? Where's my AI co-pilot? I feel the need for speed. Well, I'm sorry to break it to you, but if you want trust, remember that's what this is all about, you're going to have to slow down. But don't worry too much. You can still have that AI co-pilot. It might just look a little different than you imagined. So this is where I have to remind you that a model's output should start, not in discussion. So whatever it produces will always be a draft. That's a given. But that being said, how do we build a workflow around our use of LLMs such that it constructs inputs where the information content exceeds or equals that of the output? And just as importantly, how do we build tools that are actually useful? Ghostwriting Q&A is an attempt to address these concerns. It's an attempt at writing with trust while centering authorship in the age of generative AI. It does this by structuring an author's interactions with LLM to maximize the information content of user-touched data. As we've made clear, it's not going to do the work for you, and using this tool won't guarantee that everyone will see you as the author of a document. Remember, context matters. But hopefully, it can solve some real problems. So like what, you ask? Well, the blank page problem comes to mind. Sometimes it can be really hard to get started. Structure can help with that. In fact, one of the structures that people use to help with that are things like outlines. And so there's a reason why this video is titled Generative Outlines, because that's what the Ghostwriter Q&A specification is. A format for writing interactive outlines, that is, representations of a document structure and content designed to mediate a dialogue between an author and an LLM. If LLMs are old hat to you, it might help to think of generative outlines as structured prompt engineering. And although the site comes preloaded with some template outlines, the hope is that folks will create their own, and that in this process, they will better collect their thinking and or help frame the thinking of the folks who use their templates. This is actually one of the driving forces behind this project. Many of you may be familiar with the access to justice gap, the fact that an overwhelming number of folks, in the US at least, with civil legal needs, they have issues that they have no access to, the tools they need to solve those civil legal needs. My lab focuses on how to improve access to justice by making it easier for folks to get the help they need. And a large stumbling block can be articulating their issues in a form that the court finds digestible. And that's in the instance where the court is the right avenue. It isn't always. But I hope one day that generative outlines will help empower folks to tell their own stories and access the help that they need and to which they are entitled. So that's my why. But how about we take things for a spin? To understand generative outlines, we need to start with an anatomy lesson. After we understand the parts of a generative outline, we'll pull them together to create a draft document. Just to be clear, if you aren't watching this from the Ghostwriter website, you can follow along at ghostwriterqa.org, which is mirrored at findmysite.org/ghostwriter. First, let's orient ourselves. By default, you can see the content of a document specification/outline under the Document Specs tab. You can load new document specifications from a list of pre-written templates, load one from a file on your computer, or start with a bare bones empty template. Now, let's zoom in to see what a specification looks like. Some of you will recognize this text as JSON. That's a common format for structuring data, which pairs names with values. Right now, we're looking at the content of an entire specification file. It is and as you can see, it's composed of parts. We'll quickly look at each of them, then loop back around to explore them in more detail. The first part, labeled config, lists a set of configurations for your document, things like whether or not it should auto-generate a summary. The second part, labeled framing, is a natural language explanation of the document's purpose, written as an instruction to the document. And this is followed by the document's background, a set of predefined questions which apply to the entire document. And up next, the meat of specifications sections. Here you define the content you're looking for by section, section by section. And finally, at the end of each document, there is a space for the outlines output. This includes both the machine's first draft and the most recent edited version. So it sounds like we're ready to dive in. You probably don't need to worry too much about the configurations, but let's walk through them anyway. First, you specify what version of the specifications you are using. Right now, there's only one version, but in the future, if we change how things work, this may become important. You can define if the document should write an abstract intro based on the sections below. If the value of bottom-up abstract is true, it will add an LLM written summary of your section to the front of your document. False, it won't add one. Include section headings, that's what it says. If true, it will add section headings to each section. If false, it won't. When drafting a document, the would-be author will be asked a set of questions. The most important questions are the discovery questions. These can be pre-written or generated by the LLM. If generated by the LLM, they attempt to elicit the information needed to write a given section. And you can cap how many discovery questions the author is asked per section by setting this value. And so it just has to be an integer value there. Follow-up questions are based on an author's answer to a discovery question, and you can set how many to ask here as well. At this time, follow-up questions are based only on the answer to the last discovery question. That is, if you set max follow-up questions to 5, say it will ask 5 questions about the original discovery question, not 5 questions that each build on each other. And again, that should just be an integer value. We didn't talk about it much above, but to prevent LLMs from generating the same answer to every prompt that starts the same, their developers make use of a value to determine sort of how creative they should be. That is how far they are allowed to stray from the most probable next word. They call this value temperature. So you can turn that up to get more divergent content, and it has to be a value between 0 and 1. The outline works by stitching together user inputs along with some connective text to create responsive prompts, like the method we sort of described above. And if you want to see what those prompts are, you just set verbose equal to true, false, and you won't see those. As we saw above, framing is a natural language explanation of the document's purpose, written as an instruction to the document. It follows by a set of predefined, or rather, it's followed by a set of predefined questions, which apply to the entirety of the document. If the values are left null, that's computer science speak for empty, the author will be asked these questions. You can, however, fill in the answers as well, if you like. The meat of your outline is sections. You can have multiple sections, and each section is made up of smaller parts. First is the section title. Here it's called general. This is what would show up in the section heading if you had headings turned on. And it's a good idea to make these descriptive, as the LLM will see them as part of their prompt. Your description is the most important part of your section, as it defines what the content should look like. The more detail, the better. Approximate length in words is pretty self-explanatory, but keep in mind that the text in your section will be drawn in part from the author's answers. So if you're asking for text in excess of what you expect to get as input, there might not be any there. So just be careful with that. And now we come to the discovery questions. You can and probably should just leave this as is. That is just an empty set of square brackets. If you do, the LLM will produce a set of discovery questions for the author based on the section description and their answers to the background questions. You can, however, override this behavior by writing your own questions within curly few brackets like this. Again, if the answer is left null, the author will be prompted to provide it. You shouldn't touch the summary of text entries, as this is where the file will store its output. If text is found here, the system won't ask about any of the above questions. It'll just assume it's done and skip to the next part. And of course, you can have multiple sections, each with their own titles, descriptions, lengths, discovery questions, and outputs. And there's, at the very end, your content of your draft document. And you shouldn't touch this part unless you're editing the content. This is where you can find the first machine draft as well as the most recent edited version. So please play around and write your own outlines. And if you do, be sure to save them. It's worth noting that this is also how you save your progress on an outline. That being said, let's have a quick tour of the buttons, and then we'll get right to it. When you decide to start, we'll be clicking on the Build from Document Specs button. If we want, we can turn on Word Wrap to make editing the outline easier. And you may want to consider turning on the beep when done by using this toggle here. And that's because sometimes it can take a while for the LLM to process a request. And it's nice to have an audio indicator that it's not working. Mostly this just saves you from having to sit there and stare at the spinner while waiting. You can go off and do something else. Also, you can always get back to this video again by clicking on the show video link. Oh, and here's a real good pro tip. You can resize the left and right panels by dragging the divider. Okay, well, let's write a document. Okay, here we are over at the Find My Site version of the Ghostwriter Q&A tool. In the left pane here is our, we can see our specifications. Over on the right here, this is where the video would be if we were looking at the video, but also, since I've hidden it now, it's where it will be asked our question. So I'm going to go ahead and hit Build Document from Specs. And it's going to go ahead and say, before we get into the body of our text, let's start with some background questions, right? So it's queuing up those background questions that we pre-wrote there. These are based on a journaling exercise I do with my students. So there are a couple of questions in the background that I want to make sure we always hit, and then it will diverge based upon people's answers to that. So how comfortable did you feel brainstorming in front of the team this week? I'm going to say very. When your fellow team members said they'd get something done, did they? I'm going to say yes. They've got a great team. Did you start the week knowing what your goals were and how to reach them? I'm going to say yes. What worked well this week? I'll say I started early. It's one that I often hear people like. And what didn't work well this week? I'll say I forgot to ask questions. So asking for help, that can be hard. Can you think of anything new we should try? If so, what? If I provided a robust answer here, that would probably help the quality of my journal entry, but for now, I'm just going to try to make it quick. So I'm just going to say no. And you can see here that now it's going to think about things for a while. If we look over on the left of the screen here, we're going to notice when this finishes, it's going to add, there it just did, it populated the discovery questions there with a set of discovery questions it's now going to ask me. So how did the experience of brainstorming in front of the team make you feel? Say I scared a little that folks would judge me or judge my ideas. So I'll just say that and see what it thinks about that for a follow-up question. It says, did you feel that you were able to express your ideas freely during the brainstorming session? That's yes, that was a nice surprise. Now we're back to sort of our level of discovery questions. We can see it filled in the follow-up there, the specifications on the left. And it says, what could you do differently to make experience more productive in the future? Well, I'd already said something about asking questions. You could ask more questions and I get stuck, I suppose. And again, since this is that was a discovery question, and we then get a follow-up question that's going to be based upon that. It says, what strategies did you use to start early this week? Okay, so this is actually, it's actually based on that follow-up question. It's remembering some of the background questions, and so it's actually deciding to follow up on the previous stuff. So what strategies did you use to start early this week? I could answer that. I can also, for all of the follow-up questions, I can skip. I'll just skip that to make this quicker. Use displays tell me anything else I should know. I'm also going to skip that question as well and then just go on. This will then move into the second section here that I have in this. And this section here, I have it set up. There's a sort of a general and then a specific. The specific, if I turn on the word wrap there, you can see the specific is a deeper dive into the event in the week, maybe something discussed in the general section. This section is to focus on how the event made the author feel and what they learned from the experience, either about themselves or the work. And as you can see, it can take a while for it to think about this sometimes. So there we go. I'll have a sip of my tea. It's already answered, but I'll have a sip of my tea. And so now it's saying the following questions will focus on info we need to write specific, which is our second section. And then it says, here's the description of specific. So it's telling us what it's looking for. What did you learn about yourself or the work from this experience? Learned that it's very helpful when you can trust your team. Of course, I'm just sort of doing banalities, so I'm going to get banalities out. But do you feel comfortable in the team's brainstorming environment? Yes. Use the space to tell me anything else I should know. So I'm just going to say, I can't think of anything else. And it's going to think a little. Now what it's going to do is going to take those two sections. We'll see actually that it wrote a section here. We saw that it wrote that first section earlier. I'm sorry, we're just in the almost there. There's a set for a follow-up there. And it's going to ask me some of that. I'll skip that though, because I don't need to get to that. And now it's going to go ahead and you can see I just did this question here. It's going to fill that in. Now it's going to fill in the summary for the second section. And then it will take those two sections together. It will then also create a abstract based upon the content of those questions, or an intro based upon those questions. I have the section titles on, so we'll see each of those sections and we'll see where that comes from. This is kind of overkill for this document. I don't think you normally would need to have the abstract intro turned on for a two-section journal entry. In fact, you're probably trying to get it shorter as opposed to longer content, but this is just to show off the functionality of the tool. And again, we've got this long spinning. I have the beep when done on that, so I can go over and maybe view some other websites, do some other stuff, and then I'll hear the beep when it's done. So let's just, you and I watch this together for a second, and then when it beeps, we'll see the result. All right, and there we go. It says your draft document is ready for review. And now it moved over from our document specs to our draft. And then here's our draft document. You can see it has a summary which is a summary based upon these individual sections. The summary says this week was a successful and productive one. The team working together in a collaborative environment. I'll be able to surprise myself with some of the ideas I came up with. So some of this is it's sort of free forming here. So this would be a type of thing where you really want to constrain it in and make sure that the author went to edit this back down. But as you'll see here, you can recognize that the text that we put in and the content of that at least as what comes up in this output, and you can play around with it. Obviously the more info you put in when feeding the prompts, the better the answers are going to be. Otherwise, it's going to fall into that problem that we talked about previously of just making stuff up based upon the fact that it doesn't have a critical mass of input. And so your job is to make sure that you give it enough to get good content. But as you can see very quickly, that gets us to having something, and then we can noodle on this draft and edit and re-edit until we have something that we really feel proud of as something that we're authors of. And that is that. That is the Ghostwriter Q&A specifications and the tool that implements them, and some of my thoughts about LLMs. And go to the site. I hope you enjoy it. And if you have any questions, please feel to reach out to me. I'm on Mastodon at Colarusso at mastodon.social. You can also find more information about the lab at suffolklab.org. Thank you.